I am Inspector, and I solve mystery. Welcome to my new case.
It was Oxford in late October, when the stones carried the scent of last night's rain and the air pressed itself into the lungs with a damp insistence. The cloisters of St. Simon's were deserted, save for the scrape of a bicycle wheel against flagstone and a whistle, faint, uncertain, trailing through the quadrangle like something half forgotten. Schubert, of all things. The opening strain of the Trout Quintet played not with precision, but with the halting rhythm of a man remembering rather than performing. I was not there to hear it. The memory is not mine, though I would come to inhabit it in time. It belonged to Celia Mayberry, a lecturer in English poetry whose hair carried the sheen of rain when she stepped under the archway. She heard the tune, stopped, half-turned as though someone might be leaning from a window, yet found nothing but shadows and the sound of pigeons shifting along the eaves. She told me later that it unsettled her precisely because it was imperfect. A true musician, she said, never falters on the intervals. It was the whistle of someone who wanted only to be recognized. By the following morning, the quad was empty again, and Celia, folding her scarf tightly against her throat, passed a newspaper stand outside Broad Street, the Oxford Mail. The obituary was small, 3 inches of column space between a notice of a lecture on Greek metrics and an advertisement for second-hand typewriters. Dr. Henry Arkwright, retired Fellow of St. Simon's College, was buried yesterday following his sudden death at home. He is survived by his widow. That was all. She read it once, then again, and felt a peculiar tightening in her chest. She had known Arkwright in the most casual of ways. A nod in the library, a shared mutter about the heating. But it was the past tense of the verb that pressed itself on her. Was buried yesterday. The phrase felt impatient, as though the man had been hastily dispatched into the earth, and then, of course, the whistle returned to her. She could not decide whether she had heard it from within the college or from across the street, but she remembered it distinctly, as though someone had tried to speak without words. That evening I was alone in Jericho, in a public house with a scratched mahogany bar and a mirror that showed me the disapproval of my own face. I'd ordered a pint of bitter and was pretending not to notice the couple opposite, their hands lingering together in the silence between them. My paper lay folded on the counter, the same obituary circled by the damp of my glass. It was not grief that made me read it 3 times. I had not known Arkwright except as one of those classical men who walked the streets with a certain hauteur, the toga invisible but implied. What troubled me was the phrasing. The paper usually reported such matters in the gentler sequence of life. Died peacefully at home on Tuesday. Funeral to follow. But this notice reversed the order. He was already underground before I had known he had ceased to exist. There was a crossword in the corner of the page. I glanced at it out of habit. Found an easy clue. Burial notice. 8 letters. And answered it automatically. Obituary. Yet even as I penciled it in, I felt the faint unease of tautology. The clue seemed to circle the thing itself, like a dog sniffing its own tail. I drank, thought about calling Strange, thought better of it. Lewis would be at home, children perhaps tumbling around his ankles. I had no one at mine but a half-empty bottle of whiskey in the silence of the flat. The whistle came back to me, though I had not heard it, only borrowed the memory from the obituary's edges. Schubert played badly in a place that prided itself on perfection. I remember walking home that night past the iron railings of Worcester. The leaves pressed slick against the pavement. I could not have said why the phrase unsettled me. Why was buried yesterday carried more menace than died suddenly? But I have long believed that crimes begin not with blood, but with language. Words are careless things, and when they falter, something darker often follows. That was the first time I thought of Henry Arkwright, not as a scholar, nor as a corpse, but as a puzzle. A man who whistled Schubert poorly, and who went into the ground more quickly than Oxford would ordinarily allow. The reception was held in the senior common room, which seemed to me a rather theatrical choice. The curtains had been drawn against the thin light of afternoon, and the fire that usually spluttered with collegiate pride had been allowed only the faintest glow. Death is never quite comfortable in Oxford. It sits in the chairs like an uninvited examiner. Lewis, poor man, wore his suit as though it belonged to another. He stood near the door at first, shuffling his feet as though uncertain whether policemen were ever truly welcome among decanters of sherry. I drifted further in, drawn less by conversation than by the heavy scent of carnations. The wreaths had been placed along the mantel, the most prominent inscribed in faded gold, with a line I half recognized. Death is the golden key that opens the palace of eternity. Coleridge, perhaps, though I could not be certain. Half a line wrong in any case. The sort of error a widow might not have noticed, but one which a classics man like Arkwright would have abhorred. Mrs. Arkwright stood not far from it, a glass of white wine untouched in her hand. She was elegant in that restrained English way, pearls at the throat, black dress without ornament, and yet there was nothing softened by grief in her face. Her civility was cool, rehearsed, as though she had already endured a season of condolence and wished to move briskly on. When Lewis murmured something about her husband's service to the college, she smiled faintly, thanked him, and turned away before the words had settled. The others formed their little constellations around the room. I observed them as one might observe a painting whose meaning lies in the shadows rather than the figures. There was the young Don, not long out of doctoral robes, whose ambition was betrayed by the nervous clench of his hands. He spoke earnestly of future publications, of lectures abroad, of unfinished manuscripts, as if death itself were merely another deadline to be noted and ignored. His eyes moved too quickly across the room, looking not at people, but at opportunities. The bursar, by contrast, anchored himself heavily by the hearth. A stout man with a complexion of perpetual indignation, he muttered darkly about expenses, about legacies squandered, about the perils of leaving money in the hands of widows. His grief, if such it was, had already been translated into arithmetic. I noticed Lewis watching him with the mild suspicion of a man who distrusted numbers when they were spoken with too much fervor. And then the librarian, poor fellow, hovered by the bookcase with the air of a rabbit that had stumbled into the wrong burrow. His spectacles were smudged, his tie a shade too bright for morning, and whenever addressed, he began with an apology. I learned little from his words, which trailed into ellipses, but much from his silences. He had known Arkwright more intimately than he wished to admit. It was from the lips of the young Don, flushed with ambition and sherry, that the rumor of the will emerged. Arkwright had revised it only weeks before his death, he confided, leaning toward a cluster of eager ears. Someone, he said, had been cut out. Someone close. He would not say who, though his glance slid toward the bursar in a manner both deliberate and cowardly. I stood by the sherry table, swirling the liquid in my glass, pretending to admire its tawny clarity. What interested me was not the rumor itself. Oxford has always been addicted to the perfume of inheritance. But the speed with which it traveled, the relish with which it was spoken in the very room where his widow stood. Death had not silenced them. It had merely given them sharper tongues. The misquoted wreath glimmered at the edge of my vision, the golden key that opens the palace of eternity. It was wrong, subtly wrong, and I could not shake the sense that such errors, like cracks in a facade, reveal more than they conceal. I left the room with the taste of sherry lingering and the quiet conviction that Henry Arkwright's departure had been neither sudden nor simple. Lewis, dutiful as ever, busied himself with the paper trail. He telephoned doctors who spoke with the dryness of men who signed too many certificates, scribbled notes on cremation permits, and returned to me with pockets filled with small facts I pretended to need. Death, officially speaking, was heart failure, an unremarkable end for a man of Arkwright's years. I nodded, poured myself a whiskey, and thought only that bureaucracy prefers its corpses to be predictable. I, meanwhile, allowed my feet to lead me where they always did in moments of uncertainty. The Bodleian. There is no finer refuge for the restless mind. The smell alone, vellum, dust, the faint trace of candle soot lingering even in an age of electric bulbs, has always steadied me more than doctors' reports ever could. I had asked, without ceremony, for the Arkwright collection. His books bore the marks of a man who conversed more freely with the dead than with the living. On the margin of a tattered volume of Horace, I found a phrase underlined twice: fidus in adversis, perfidus in rebus secundis, faithful in adversity, treacherous in prosperity. His own neat Latin hand had added a question mark beside it, as if uncertainty had been gnawing at him. Who, I wondered, was the perfidious one? I carried the book to a desk by the window, where the college librarian happened to hover, fussing with catalogue cards that no one under 40 ever touched. His face, pale beneath the library lamps, seemed ill-suited to dissembling. Yet when I asked, lightly, whether Arkwright had often worked here in his final months, he hesitated too long. At last he admitted there had been a visitor. Not the widow, a woman who came repeatedly, always in the late afternoons when the library was near empty. She would sit with him, speaking in voices too low for others to catch. The librarian claimed to have noticed nothing more, but his fingers tightened around the card drawer until the veins stood out blue. I thanked him and let the silence expand, for silence is often more revealing than questions. He busied himself with a stack of unshelved volumes, his ears flushed pink. When I left the Bodleian, dusk had already seeped into the city. The air smelled of wet leaves and bicycle grease. I crossed the quad of St. Simon's, footsteps muffled on the damp stones, when I heard it again. The whistle, Schubert's Trout Quintet, the same halting notes as if someone sought recognition rather than melody. I stopped, looked about. The windows were dark, save for a faint glow behind the SCR curtains. No one in sight, only the echo, thin as thread, unraveling into the autumn air. It meant nothing, and yet it refused to leave. Like the crossword clue that offers too many plausible answers, it nagged without revealing. Arkwright dead, hurried to ground. A widow cool as polished stone, a young don eager to inherit more than books, a bursar who counted grief in ledgers, a librarian too nervous for comfort, and somewhere, unseen, unheard except in fragments, a woman. I thought of Horace again, faithful in adversity, treacherous in prosperity. The tune clung to me as I walked back through the dripping streets, the cadence of a man who wished to be remembered not for what he played, but for what he dared not say. Her name was Celia Mayberry, and she belonged to that particular Oxford species, the lecturer whose brilliance had already outpaced her years, and yet whose eyes carried the fatigue of someone. Older, I found her in her rooms at the college, where the curtains filtered the afternoon into a thin amber light. Books pressed against every wall, some stacked in fragile towers on the floor, their spines sagging under the weight of annotation. The scent was of tea leaves and dust, sharpened faintly by the trace of rain on stone. She had agreed with a kind of reluctant courtesy to see me. I sat opposite her at a narrow oak desk, my chair catching against a warped floorboard, while she poured tea into cups that had once been white. I noticed her hand tremble only once, when she steadied the saucer against the pot. It was she, I reminded myself, who had first heard the whistle. She confirmed it without hesitation, not once, but several times. Always in the twilight, as the college cloisters emptied and the air carried the hush of preparation for evensong. A low tune, imperfectly rendered, that seemed to announce an arrival rather than to entertain. She told me she had often seen Arkwright then, slipping from the library steps or pausing in the quad, his face half hidden by scarf and dusk. He would stand for a moment, waiting, humming or whistling that same fragment of Schubert until another figure appeared. She never caught the figure clearly. Once she thought it was a woman, slight in build. Another time, merely a shadow moving quickly toward the gate. She had wondered at first whether it was an assignation of passion, but then dismissed the thought. Arkwright was a man not of ardor, but of secrecy. He met not for desire, she suspected, but for concealment. Her voice carried the precision of someone who had trained her mind to dissect language, yet behind it there was a softness, an ache that slipped through despite her best efforts. She spoke of Arkwright with neither fondness nor disdain, only with the curiosity of one who recognizes in others the fractures they know in themselves. I asked about her own interest in Victorian poetry, and she answered without enthusiasm, as though reciting a line from memory rather than conviction. Her eyes drifted, almost unconsciously, to a framed photograph on the mantel. Herself and a man smiling, the corners of the picture curling with age. The image was tucked partially behind a row of monographs, as though half forgotten but not quite buried. I did not press. She volunteered after a pause that the engagement had ended 2 years before. No bitterness, only a kind of academic footnote to her own life. She had stayed in Oxford. He had not. The silence after her words seemed to fill the room more heavily than the books themselves. There was something in her sadness that unsettled me more than any confession of guilt would have done. I found myself studying the small gestures, the way she turned the handle of her teacup precisely to the right, the faint smudge of ink on her finger, the cadence of her breath when she spoke of dusk. These were the details that revealed more than testimony ever could. When she returned to the subject of Arkwright, it was with the same detached care. She said she had once heard him misquote Tennyson to his unseen companion, though she could not recall the exact phrasing. The words had struck her as oddly tender, less the language of a husband than of a man clinging to an echo of youth. I made no remark about it, but inwardly I noted the connection. The misquotation on the funeral wreath, the half-remembered words, the whistle slightly out of tune. Arkwright, it seemed, lived in approximations, in the dangerous realm where error conceals intention. As we finished our tea, the rain began again outside, tapping gently against the mullioned glass. I wanted, absurdly, to linger. There was a clarity in her mind, a vulnerability in her sadness that pulled at me with an old and foolish longing. Yet we spoke with the reserve that Oxford teaches so well, careful, measured, always one step behind the heart. I left her office with the impression not of answers, but of echoes. The whistle persisted in my thoughts, and her voice with it. 2 fragments of music, both incomplete, refusing to resolve into harmony. It was Lewis, not I, who first dragged the bursar into focus. He had unearthed, with the patience of a man well versed in paperwork, a handful of ledgers that stank of quiet manipulation. Figures bent here, a column disguised there, money siphoned with the sleight of hand only a seasoned accountant would admire. More damning still, there were quarrels, overheard by the scouts, muttered in corridors. Between Arkwright and the bursar, quarrels sharp enough to carry through locked doors. The matter of the will returned like a wasp. Arkwright, it seemed, had intended a bequest to the college, a sum not negligible. Yet the latest draft hinted at alterations, and if whispers were to be trusted, the bursar had been central to that change. No man clings so jealously to numbers unless he fears their departure. Lewis was proud to tell me, later that week, that he had spotted the bursar's car parked close to the cemetery on the eve of burial. An idle curiosity had led him to note the registration. He described it with the enthusiasm of a man who felt he had cornered his prey. The bursar explained it easily, of course. A drive taken in melancholy, a need for solitude among the stones. He had been seen by another Don, returning across Magdalen Bridge at roughly the time in question. The alibi held with the irritating solidity of something true. Yet it was all too neat. Death, in my experience, resists neatness. The bursar's resentment, his ledger tricks, the presence of his car by the graves. It was the sort of sequence a detective novel would set out with smug satisfaction. I felt, as always, the faint nausea of being led along a path laid too deliberately. That evening I returned to my flat with the drizzle still on my coat and set the needle to Schubert, the Trout Quintet. The same phrases I'd heard, whistled badly across stone quads. But in the purity of piano and strings, I heard what had been absent in that thin human echo. The fluidity, the inevitability of resolution. Whoever had whistled it had known only fragments, stumbling through memory without understanding the line. I poured whiskey and sat with a crossword, not to solve it, but to let the black and white boxes mock me into thought. One clue, to sound through the lips, to signal, 7, gave me pause. I wrote whistle, then stared at it until the letters blurred. To whistle was not only to make music, it was to call a dog, to alert a friend, to signal in the dark. A whistle could be a summons, not a song. I muttered it aloud, half amused at my own slowness. Perhaps Arkwright had not been whistling at all, but answering. Perhaps the tune was less about melody than recognition, a code between two souls who needed no words. The room settled into silence again, the only sound the scratch of my pencil on the crossword's margin. Lewis's bursar remained a plausible villain, greedy, resentful, opportunistic. But I could not bring myself to believe it. Villainy in Oxford rarely presents itself so baldly. More often, it hides in the gentle slip of a line of poetry or in a woman's half-averted gaze. I listened once more to the Schubert, letting it play beyond the familiar opening into passages less known. Outside, the rain intensified against the glass, and the city lay quiet. I felt the first stirrings of suspicion that the crime, if crime it was, had nothing to do with ledgers or wills at all. It lay instead in something smaller, more intimate, hidden within the broken cadence of a tune carried across stone. It was Lewis who carried the diary into my office, wrapped clumsily in brown paper as though it were a loaf of bread. He placed it on my desk with a kind of reverence, though his voice was gruff when he spoke. Belonged to the old man. They found it in the desk drawer, bottom left. Seemed private, but the widow said we ought to have it. I untied the string and let the covers fall open. Arkwright's hand was precise, almost arrogant in its neatness. Days catalogued in the manner of a scholar arranging evidence, each entry clipped to a few sentences. Dinners attended, lectures noted, ailments recorded with a degree of intimacy usually reserved for doctors. It was the sort of document that aspired to permanence. And then, about 3 weeks before his death, a gap. One page had been torn out cleanly, the stub of paper feathered along the binding. No clumsy accident. A deliberate removal, the sort of violence more shocking than any blot of ink. The entries resumed the following day, calm as before, but the absence pressed harder than the presence. Lewis, meanwhile, had returned to Mrs. Arkwright. He recounted the conversation with his usual mixture of unease and thoroughness. She had received them politely in her drawing-room, curtains drawn though the day was bright, and admitted, with a kind of detached amusement, that her husband had developed an infatuation. A girl from the library, she called her, with the wave of a hand. No threat, no scandal, merely the vanity of an aging man who mistook attention for affection. Lewis reported her words faithfully, but I distrusted them at once. A woman dismisses so lightly only that which she fears to weigh too heavily. I turned the diary again in my hands, the torn edge like a wound. Why remove only a single page? Not a week, not a month, but a solitary entry. That sort of precision speaks of guilt or of memory too painful to leave intact. Later that afternoon, I sought out Celia Mayberry. She received me in her office, though she seemed wearier than before, her desk cluttered with papers that looked less studied than abandoned. We spoke of ordinary things at first: the weather, the new intake of students, the perpetual decay of Oxford stone. Then, without prompting, she mentioned Arkwright again. She recalled one evening in the quad when she had overheard him speaking in low tones to someone just out of sight. A woman, she thought, though she had never been able to tell for certain. What stayed with her was not the voice, but the words. He had misquoted Tennyson, she said softly. Not the grand lines, but something gentler, spoken with a tenderness that startled her. She could not recall the exact phrasing now, only that it was wrong, slightly wrong, as though half-remembered in passion. I thought again of the wreath at the funeral, the Coleridge line twisted into clumsy shape. Misquotation seemed to follow Arkwright like a signature, deliberate or otherwise. Yet in poetry, a misstep is rarely innocent. One chooses what to remember incorrectly. As she spoke, her eyes moved not to me but to the rain streaking the window. I had the impression that she wanted to confess something else, but lacked the language for it. Oxford trains its scholars well in silence. I walked back across the quad with the diary under my arm. The torn page nagged at me like an unsolved clue in a crossword, one blank space ruining the symmetry of the whole. I tried to imagine who had removed it. The widow? Jealous, perhaps, of a name inscribed in tenderness. Celia herself? Unlikely. And then the librarian, that nervous wisp of a man with hands too eager to tidy and conceal. His evasions in the Bodleian returned to me now with sharper edges. I had no proof, only intuition, but intuition has always been my most treacherous companion. It whispers in the dark, insisting upon patterns before they exist, and yet I could not escape the feeling that the missing page, the misquoted verse, the whistle in the dusk, all were threads of the same fabric, a fabric woven most tightly in the library's quiet shadows. The diary closed with a soft thud in my hands. The silence of my rooms pressed against me, heavy with unwritten words. I poured myself a drink and stared at the crossword grid until the squares blurred. Nothing fit, not yet, but I knew the librarian's name would one day find its place among the answers. The librarian received me in a room that seemed too large for him. Tall shelves leaned under the weight of books no one had touched in decades, the dust motes shifting like anxious thoughts in the late light. He stood near his desk, pale and restless, fingers fretting with a pencil as though it might vanish if he let go. "You've been avoiding us," I said. Not an accusation, more a statement of fact. "I've had work," he murmured. "The catalogues don't arrange themselves." I gestured at the diary under my arm. "Arkwright met you, often in these rooms. Your silence makes it look worse than it is." His throat worked visibly. Then, with a sort of sudden resolve that collapses as quickly as it forms, he sat down and pressed his hands flat upon the desk. "Yes," he admitted. "We met. But it was not what people are saying. Nothing sordid. He came about the poem." "The poem?" He glanced toward the locked cabinet at the far end of the room. After a moment's hesitation, he fetched a small key from his waistcoat pocket and turned the lock with a click that seemed unnaturally loud. From within, he drew a folio bound in cracked leather, the edges furred with age. He set it before me as one might lay down evidence. "An obscure miscellany," he explained. "College archives. Neglected. Forgotten." But Arkwright loved to haunt the corners where no one else looked. He believed one of the pieces, a Victorian acrostic, concealed a second meaning. He asked my help in working it through. I opened the folio with care. The Latin lines marched stiffly across the page, initials spelling out the expected name, yet scanning further I saw what he meant. One word, a single, stubborn word, out of place, its letters breaking the sequence. Not an error of copying, for the hand was steady and confident, but an intentional disruption. "Alter the word," the librarian whispered, leaning close, "and the acrostic reads differently. Not praise for the poet, but accusation, a betrayal hidden in plain sight. Arkwright thought it could change how we view him, unmask a secret quarrel, perhaps even scandal." "And why the secrecy?" I asked. He swallowed. "Because Henry insisted on it. He loved the thrill of concealment. He said discovery must come like a conjuring trick, all surprise at the end. But he grew obsessed. He would pace, muttering variants, humming to himself as if the tune might unlock the pattern." "A Schubert tune," I said quietly. The librarian's eyes darted up, startled. "Yes. How did you—" But I let the question hang. Instead, I traced the misplaced word again with my finger, feeling the tremor of intention behind it. Something about the wrongness of it pressed on me with the same weight as the torn diary page. Not merely academic mischief, not only a puzzle. Shadow stretched behind it, as though someone else's hand had shaped the riddle. "Did Arkwright speak of this to anyone else?" "Only once. A woman, I think. I glimpsed her leaving, but he never named her. He said some truths are safest when left half hidden." I closed the folio carefully and pushed it back toward him. He locked it away again, visibly relieved, though his pallor had not lifted. I left him to his dust and catalogues, my own thoughts unsettled. Walking out into the quadrangle, I felt the autumn dusk tightening around the stones. The whistle, the diary's wound, the acrostic with its one deliberate flaw, all tugged in the same direction, yet the shape they formed remained out of reach. Deception, I thought, is rarely confined to the page. Someone had moved words and memories with equal calculation, and Arkwright, in chasing a hidden poem, may have stumbled into a larger design, one that outlived him. The young Don, Dr. Peter Haldane, greeted me in his rooms with the air of a man who had rehearsed the scene in advance. Books in purposeful disorder, a sheaf of proofs strewn across the desk, a pipe left conspicuously in view, though I doubted he smoked it more than occasionally. All calculated to project the image of the overworked, underappreciated scholar. "You've come about Henry," he said, offering me a chair with brittle civility. "Everyone seems to assume I must be involved. The police, his widow, the porters whispering in the quad. Now you too." "I come," I replied, "because his death and his papers seem to have caused more disturbance in this college than the Blitz ever managed. And your name does crop up rather often." He flushed, then leaned back, folding his arms. I had reason to fear him, yes. That much I won't deny. Arkwright had hinted at something, a discovery that would overturn the foundations of my book. Imagine years of research and labor undone by one of his damned marginal notes. He never respected boundaries. What sort of discovery? He shrugged, a little too theatrically. Some nonsense in a manuscript. He thought he'd found proof that one of the minor Victorians, a poet I happened to be editing, had borrowed lines without acknowledgement. A small thing, you'd say, but in academic circles, reputations hinge on such scraps. My publisher would have asked awkward questions. So your career, your livelihood, stood in danger of being derailed. His eyes flared. Derailment is too mild a word. It would have been humiliation. To be made a footnote in Arkwright's twilight years. The admission hung in the air, neither quite confession nor denial. He rose suddenly, crossing to the window where the ivy clawed at the panes. I won't pretend I liked the man. He was arrogant, meddling, contemptuous of younger scholars. But I did not kill him. "You understand why suspicion falls," I said gently. "Resentment, motive, opportunity, perhaps." He turned sharply. "Opportunity." I was in London the day before he died, lecturing. Ask the registrar. Ask my students. I couldn't possibly. I let the protest run itself out, then stood. You'll forgive me if I check every alibi twice." Our eyes met, his burning with indignation, mine with the duller fire of uncertainty. There was passion in him, yes, and fear, but not the kind that bleeds into violence. His world was one of footnotes and academic rivalries, cruel enough in its way, but rarely fatal. When I left, the late afternoon drizzle had turned the flagstones slick. I lingered by the porter's lodge, considering the shape of the conversation. Haldane had reasons aplenty to loathe Arkwright, but his protestations rang with too much self-dramatizing flair. A guilty man often hides behind bluster, yet sometimes the innocent, too, perform their roles when cornered. That evening, back in my flat, I poured a whiskey and set Schubert on the turntable. The familiar bars of the unfinished drifted into the silence. I spread my crossword across the table, pencil at the ready, and forced my mind away from the dead professor. Letters clicked into place. Obscure argument. Something left out. 7. I frowned. The crossings gave it readily enough. Elision. A word I'd written countless times in my notes, but tonight it struck a peculiar chord. Something removed rather than spoken. Something cut away to conceal, not to reveal. I sat back, glass in hand, and the thought returned with stubborn clarity. Arkwright's diary, the page so carefully torn. That was the true absence in this case, more eloquent than any quarrels or jealousies. Elision, a silence more telling than words. I closed my eyes, letting the music swell. Haldane had given me nothing solid, only smoke and irritation, a false turn, perhaps, though even false turns mark the map. The missing page, the whistled tune, the misquoted line of poetry. These were the real clues, sharper than any academic grievance. And yet, as always, the path forward remained obscured, as though the solution hovered just beyond reach, waiting for one more connection to bring it into view. Lewis had that careful look he wore when he came bearing news he wasn't entirely sure how I would take. We met in the draughty passage outside the chapel, where the light from the stained glass fell dull on the flagstones. He shifted his notebook in his hands, as though its weight was suddenly awkward. "Sir," he began, "I checked the paperwork. The death certificate. It was signed by Dr. Fenton." "Yes." "Only, he never saw the body. Signed it in his surgery, he told me. Said Mrs. Arkwright was insistent. Said she needed the forms quickly. He'd treated the professor for years and assumed it was the heart again. Didn't ask questions." I felt the faint chill that comes when the ground shifts underfoot. So no doctor actually examined him. Not even after. Lewis shook his head. Straight to the undertaker's. Quicker that way, apparently. It was not the first time bureaucracy had been bent to convenience, but in this case, the convenience had swallowed the truth entire. If no one had examined Henry Arkwright in death, then his manner of dying lay wholly in the hands of those who stood to gain. Later, in my rooms, I unfolded the cutting I had kept, the obituary from the Oxford Mail, the one that had first caught my eye. I read again the phrase that had gnawed from the beginning. He was buried yesterday. Too pat, too final. The obituary writer had sounded as if following a script, anxious to hurry the reader past awkward detail. I tapped the cutting against the table, listening to the music that spun in my head. Not Schubert this time, but the thin echo of a whistle drifting across a darkened quad. Celia's voice came back to me, quiet in her book-lined office. He often whistled when he met someone at dusk, but the memory refused to fit. I had never once seen Arkwright whistle, hum tunelessly, yes, mutter under his breath, certainly, but whistle. Number. The thought ripened. The sound had not been his at all. It had belonged to someone else. A signal, not a habit. A way of arranging secret meetings without a word spoken. The whistle was a code, like the acrostic in that manuscript, like the torn page in the diary. I sat very still, aware that the pieces were beginning at last to touch. The false trails, the bursar's grievances, the don's jealousies, were smokescreens for a simpler truth. Someone had used the tune, borrowed it as their signature, and someone in this college had heard it often enough to mistake it for Arkwright's own. It was late when I returned to the senior common room. A few stragglers lingered over port and walnuts, voices hushed. The librarian was there, pale as ever, Celia Mayberry, lost in thought, and in the corner, Mrs. Arkwright herself, composed, elegant, detached. I moved to the sideboard, poured myself a measure of sherry, and listened. The conversation swirled but carried no weight. It was in the silence, the small hesitations between words, that truths murmured. Then, almost beneath the breath, I caught it. The faintest fragment of the tune, whistled by someone passing in the corridor outside. Not Arkwright. Never Arkwright. I stepped to the doorway. Lewis was already there, notebook ready, eyes bright with the same recognition. "Sir?" "Someone speaking," I said softly, but not in words. And in that moment I felt the case tilt, the hidden page of the puzzle about to turn. The Bodleian, in late afternoon, has a hush that seems to outlast centuries, oak-panelled silence, the smell of vellum, the dim, patient breathing of scholars. Morse sat beneath a brass lamp at one of the long tables, Lewis across from him with the air of a man not entirely at home among the manuscripts. It was the librarian who had brought them the discovery, almost by accident. A leaf of paper, folded twice, slipped into the margin of a 19th-century commonplace book Arkwright had been handling in his final weeks. Its edges were frayed, but the ink was unmistakably modern. Morse flattened it carefully, and the torn stub in Arkwright's diary aligned like bone to socket. He read in silence. The words were not the jottings of a man rehearsing his appointments. They were testimony. Truth lies in decay, in memory no less than in stone. 30 years passed. M.A. was party to an academic deceit, a falsified attribution in the Furnival collection. The affair was smothered, names shielded, but the signal endures. The whistle in the quad, a relic of a liaison that nearly cost her career. If this should ever be known, reputations will fall, mine not least. Morse let the page rest. For once he did not reach for his pen, nor a crossword grid. He looked instead at Lewis, whose brows knitted in concentration. "M.A.," Lewis said at length. "That'd be Mrs. Arkwright." Morse nodded slowly. "Margaret Arkwright. Before her marriage, she published, very briefly, under her maiden name. There was a minor scandal, but minor only because it was buried." "And the whistle?" "A signal," Morse murmured. "The lover she feared to acknowledge. It was their secret call. Arkwright stumbled upon it. That's why he noted it. That's why he died." The air in the reading room seemed suddenly close. Morse rose, folded the page into his pocket, and asked the librarian to fetch Mrs. Arkwright to the rector's rooms. She came within the hour, composed as always, her black dress immaculate, her gloved hands folded. Morse offered her a chair. Lewis hovered by the mantel, notebook at the ready. "Mrs. Arkwright," Morse began, voice gentler than she expected, "we have found your husband's diary, the missing page. He wrote of a matter long past, a deception in scholarship, a scandal." For the first time her expression shifted. A minute tremor touched her lips. "I was young," she said, "foolish. It was not malice, but ambition. A misattributed manuscript, a partner who urged me on. Henry discovered it only this year." "And threatened exposure," Morse prompted. She looked at him directly now, eyes grey and clear as glass. "He said it would all come out, that I would be ruined, my reputation destroyed. Do you understand what it means for a woman in my position to be disgraced, to have everything I have lived for, the college, the committees, the quiet respect, vanish in a column of scandal?" Lewis shifted uneasily, but Morse did not move. And so, her composure faltered. She drew off one glove, finger by finger, as though the act might buy her time. Her voice, when it came, was scarcely audible. I altered his medication, just enough. He trusted me utterly. A tablet less, a tablet more. He slipped away in his sleep, quietly. It was mercy, too. He was tired. But I could not allow the examination. That is why the doctor signed without seeing him. Why the burial was hurried, you see now. The silence afterwards was heavy, like the turning of a great stone. Morse closed his eyes for a moment, hearing again that ghost of a whistle in the quad. Not Arkwright's, but the echo of her youth, of a love and betrayal interwoven. When he spoke, his tone was almost kind. "It will have to be written down, Mrs. Arkwright. In full, no more omissions, no more torn pages." She bowed her head, as though at last the weight she had carried had become too great to bear. Lewis looked to Morse for instruction, but Morse gave none. He only folded the diary page once more, carefully, and placed it on the table between them. A relic and a confession. The inquiry ended without ceremony. A signed statement, a quiet agreement among the college authorities, and the widow's resignation to circumstances she no longer had the strength to contest. There would be no trial, not in the formal sense. Too many reputations depended on silence. Too much of Oxford's veneer relied on discreet forgetfulness. Lewis had looked at Morse across the polished oak table when the rector muttered something about avoiding scandal. The young sergeant's eyes burned with indignation, but Morse only inclined his head, as though he had heard it all before. And perhaps he had. "Justice," Lewis muttered as they left the hall, "isn't supposed to depend on whether a man wears a gown or not." Morse did not reply. His thoughts were elsewhere. On a folded diary page, on a whistle drifting across quadrangles, on the fine line between betrayal and survival. He offered Lewis a pint at the Randolph, but the younger man excused himself, saying he ought to write up the file. They parted on Beaumont Street with a handshake that was more formal than either wished. Alone, Morse turned not toward the pub, but back across the city, into the drizzle that had begun to fall. The evening lamps shone weakly through mist, and the wet cobbles reflected their glow like fragments of some broken code. His steps carried him, almost against his will, to the staircase leading up to Celia Mayberry's office. She was there, as he had known she would be. Books piled in disorder, the faint aroma of tea cooling in the cup beside her. She rose as he entered, and for a moment there was warmth in her face. Not quite welcome, but recognition, perhaps relief. "I thought you'd come," she said. Morse smiled faintly, though he had little left to smile about. "I've been told the case is over, nicely tied with ribbon, signed and sealed, but it feels unfinished." She gestured toward the chair opposite her desk. He sat, and for a few minutes neither spoke. The silence was companionable, yet threaded with things unsaid. At last she leaned forward. "You found the truth. That matters." "Does it?" Morse asked. His eyes lingered on the books, lining her shelves, Browning, Rossetti, the Victorians whose frailties she studied with such precision. "The truth leaves no one happier. Arkwright is still dead. His wife is ruined, and the rest of us shuffle away as though nothing happened. That is life," she said softly. "We salvage what we can." He looked at her then, not as witness or suspect, but as a woman. There was an ache in her expression, a tenderness shadowed by her own past hurts. He thought of her broken engagement, of the loneliness she tried to disguise with scholarship. He longed absurdly to remain, to ask if she might share supper, to hear her voice unguarded by duty. But she sensed it and shook her head with a sad smile. Rising, she moved to the door. "You should go, Inspector. We both should." "Celia." She touched his sleeve lightly and then let go. "Another time, perhaps. Or not. Good night." The latch clicked gently as she closed the door. He stood for a moment, staring at the wood panel as though he might will it open again. Then he turned and descended the staircase, his tread heavy on the worn stone. Outside, rain had gathered strength. The quad glistened, each flagstone darkened, the sound of water pattering from gutters and eaves. He paused in the archway, hands deep in his pockets, and listened, half hoping, half fearing, for that faint thread of whistled Schubert. But the night gave him only rain. Morse lit a cigarette, drew the smoke deep into his lungs, and began to walk, alone, across the sodden square. The Randolphs' bar was quiet, as it often was at that hour. A few tourists lingered over coffee, their voices a muffled hum beneath the steady clink of glasses. The barman, polishing with studied indifference, nodded Morse to his usual corner. He ordered a pint, without flourish, slipped coins onto the counter, and carried it to the seat by the window. Outside, Beaumont Street lay slick with rain, lamps blurred to halos in the damp air. Buses hissed by, students hunched under umbrellas, the city settling into its nocturnal rhythm. Morse sat with his back to the room, the pint untouched for several minutes as he rolled his pen idly across the paper before him. The crossword grid was only half filled, a scattering of solutions, a handful of obstinate blanks. He was tired, not the fatigue of sleepless nights or long interviews, but that peculiar exhaustion that came when a case had ended, its knots undone and yet left no satisfaction. Arkwright's widow had confessed, yes, but her guilt carried no triumph. Fear and shame had been her motives, not greed, not malice. To reduce a man's death to so paltry a cause was an affront Morse could not shake. He sipped at the beer at last, the taste sharp, comforting. He thought of Lewis, dutifully finishing the paperwork, no doubt restless at the outcome but too loyal to question it aloud. Morse respected him for that, though he wished, selfishly perhaps, that Lewis had, argued more, challenged him, filled the silences. The pen scratched, across, 5 letters, unlucky chance. He frowned, wrote fluke in the margin, then crossed it out. His mind wandered. Celia Mayberry's face rose before him, the sad smile with which she had closed her office door. There had been a possibility there, however faint, and he had let it drift away. Perhaps it was better so. He was no man for happy endings. A sound from the street caught his ear. At first he dismissed it, some passer-by, some student's careless tune. But then it resolved itself. Clear, unmistakable, the lilting bars of Schubert's Trout Quintet whistled softly in the damp night air. Morse froze, pint halfway to his lips. The glass trembled in his hand. For a heartbeat he thought, absurdly, impossibly, that it must be Henry Arkwright himself, returned as a ghost to haunt the cobbles of Oxford. The dead dawn, still wandering from quad to library, humming the music that had clung to him in his last weeks. The whistle faded, replaced by the hiss of tires on wet stone. Morse set down the glass and gave a short, weary laugh. A student, no doubt, or a drunk. The city was full of echoes. Oxford had a way of repeating itself, voices and tunes alike drifting through its courtyards long after their owners were gone. He bent again to the crossword, pen tapping at the stubborn squares. Unlucky chance. Mischance. Hazard. He tried each, none fitting neatly. The bar's hum resumed, plates stacked in the distance, the slow turning of pages as another guest read the Times. He finished the pint. Another might have followed, but not tonight. His head was clear enough, and clarity was rare. He looked once more out of the rain-streaked window. The tune had gone. But he knew, with the certainty that came from long years in Oxford, that it would return. Everything unfinished did in time. He folded the crossword, slipped the pen into his pocket, and rose. The chair scraped faintly against the floor. Behind him, the barman called a polite good night. Morse lifted a hand in reply, without turning. On Beaumont Street, the air was cold, the rain slackening to a mist. He paused, listening. Only silence now. No Schubert, no ghostly whistle. With a sigh, he thrust his hands deep into his coat and set off toward his flat. The puzzle could wait till morning. The tune was gone, but it would come back, as all unfinished things in Oxford always did.